Today we're going to be looking at a special topic that I think there's been a lot of interest in the church. We're going to be looking at celibacy and marriage, particularly out of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which is probably the definitive passage by Paul on the different domestic relationships. And by the way, there are several listed in this chapter. Let me just list them to you. Number 1, sexual immorality. That's a problem. Marriage, singleness, virgins, I'll talk about that in a bit, remarriage of widows and widowers. But as I look at this, there's so much confusion today. There were two basic confusions in the early church, and one is there are no guidelines in this area. The body was made for sex. We need variety. Sleep with whoever you want to. And the other one is, you can't do anything. Even marriage is sinful. It's those two extremes that have caused the real problem. And both of them are coming out of Greek philosophy, not out of the Bible. Because I guarantee you, marriage was the expected norm for Jewish people. Matter of fact, the rabbis would teach you ought to be married because of Genesis 1:28, where God says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. So they would marry whether they want to or not. Now, in this text, you say, well, Bob, is 1 Corinthians 7 a universal principle? It's in the Bible. One of the most difficult things we struggle is that God spoke to a particular people at a particular time. But everything God said was not God's will for every church at every age and every location. Now, that sounds rather scary, but just think for a minute. If celibacy was God's will for every Christian, there wouldn't be many generations of Christians. Is having slaves God's will for every generation of Christians? No. There's a unique phrase in 1 Corinthians 7 that's used over and over again that tells us this is not a universal principle. And the little phrase is, let me see it here. I had it marked and lost it. Yeah, like verse 7 and 8. Stay as you are because the time is short. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, apparently there was a unique persecution coming. There was the expectation of the second coming very soon. And Paul is saying, stay as you are, stay as I am, which seems to represent a call by an apostle to singleness. But again, that just doesn't fit all the other passages on marriage. Marriage was the normal state. And in just a second, I'll show all the places where Paul says that. I don't know if Paul was married at one time, divorced, and then chose to be single. That's what I really think. And you say, well, Bob, where do you get that? Well, from Acts, and I believe I had the reference here, 26:10, it says, I raised my hand against them, which means Paul voted for the persecution of Christians. Now, if that vote took place in the Sanhedrin, you had to be married to be a part of the Sanhedrin. Many of us think that when Paul converted, his wife left him. And so he had experienced all these different singleness, marriage, and divorce, and painful time in his life, I'm sure. This period of persecution, I think, is the unique time that celibacy is advocated. So I do not believe it's a universal principle for all Christians at all times. Now, I've talked to you in a few different topics before about this terrible dilemma. How do I make something in the Bible cultural? One of my favorite authors, Gordon Fee, has made this statement, and it makes sense to me, though I couldn't prove it to you from the Bible. If the Bible speaks with one voice on a subject, like saying homosexuality is not God's will, there's no passage that seems to disagree with that. But when it comes to women being labeled to speak and minister, the Bible seems to speak with two voices. He would say if it's one voice, it's a universal principle, every church, everywhere, every time. If there's two voices, you have to allow some freedom for this being not a universal principle, but a cultural thing. I think that makes sense to me. I want to look at marriage in the Bible as the norm and give you a couple of texts to look. Of course, Genesis 1:28, I've mentioned that. Genesis 2:18 says the same thing. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. I believe Paul himself says that marriage is an honorable state. I want to list those for you. I know it's in the outline. You can see it, but just to make sure you get it. 1 Corinthians 6:16, 7:14, which is the text we're dealing with, 2 Corinthians 11:2, and Ephesians 5:22 through 31 uses marriage as a model for Christ and his church. Now, brothers and sisters, on some of these issues that we don't agree about, and there's controversy in the church, I want to give the name of a book that has really helped me. When I was a young preacher, I just surrendered to preach. There was all this fight, even among my own denomination. I didn't know what to do. I came across a little book written by F. Bruce. Now, he's dead now, but he was a professor at a university in England. He was a Plymouth Brethren, was his denomination. And for 30 plus years, he answered the questions that were written into the Plymouth Brethren magazine every month. He put these together in a book called Answers to Questions, and he deals with all of these controversial issues from Genesis to Revelation. Now, it's not a big book, and you don't just start reading it, but when you're studying something or you're preaching on something or somebody says something in a sermon you want to check, you go to the index, you find that scripture, and then you can turn to that page. Or do you go to the subject index, find that topic, and go to that page. Now, what it's done for me is, on some of these subjects, some Christians want to fight. They don't want to talk, they just want to fight. So in my church, I have said this: listen, I will discuss that subject with you if you are willing to read F. Bruce's discussion on that subject. Because here's an evangelical, conservative scholar that gives wonderful biblical material and biblical evidence. If someone's not willing to even look at F. Bruce, I don't think I'm willing to argue with them. Celibacy, marriage. I think marriage has been such a blessing for me. I do not believe I would be the Christian I am if I didn't have a Christian wife. But other people have the gift of celibacy. I thank God for them. They got so much more done, Paul and Barnabas. But they never critique Peter for having a wife and taking her with him on his travels. So we've got to be patient on this. I hope it's helpful. God bless you. Have a good day.